Digital 410 Media proudly presents the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast with your hosts, Don Abernathy, Jeff Copsetta, and Dennis Blocker.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast, your favorite World War II based podcast. And you want to talk about baptism under fire? Boy, have we got a good night for you. Jeff is taking the night off. He's working on his college paper so he can be an actual historian. He's going to college. You guys know all that. So our friend Zach Morris is filling in tonight. I'm talking fast because the power may go out here at any moment. I'm in Florida. We got a thunderstorm going. So for the listening audience, at some point you hear me stop rambling, that means I've lost the internet. Zach and Dennis are going to carry on with the interview without me, and things will be great for everybody. So without any further ado, welcome to the show, Zach. Dennis, happy to have you back.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Zach's coming in strong with a great guest tonight. Zach, without any further ado, why don't you introduce our guest?
Absolutely. So I want to thank author Craig Symonds for joining us today. He is the author of the new book, Annapolis Goes to War, the Naval Academy class of 1940 and its trial by fire in World War II. So we're excited to talk about that one. But he is also the author of one of my favorite books of all time, Neptune, which is possibly one of the best written books on the amphibious forces in the European theater that I've ever come across. So thank you, Craig, for joining us tonight. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Zach. Appreciate being invited.
So why don't you tell us about this new book, this Annapolis Goes to War? You know, what's a little background on that?
Well, it's interesting. I wrote a book among the two, other than the two you already named, on Chester Nimitz, called Nimitz at War. And that was my most recent book. And I looked at World War II in the Pacific from his viewpoint. That is, in a way, from 30,000 feet, you know, the commander's view of the largest theater of World War II, 65 million square miles. And it gave a certain perspective. But I wanted to do something that gave the perspective of the junior officers, the 01, 02, eventually 03, young officers who, you know, conned the ships and flew the planes and charged the beaches, who did the dirty work of the Pacific War. And one way to do that was to look at the class of 1940. And I was extraordinarily lucky, in a way, that at their 45th reunion, the members of the class of 1940 decided that as a gift to the Naval Academy, they had already given a stained glass window to the chapel, but they wanted to do something more that connected them with the next generation of midshipmen. And they decided that anybody who wanted to participate should sit down and write out answers to 9 questions. Why did you go to the Naval Academy? What was plebe year like? What was the rest of your experience like? What sport did you play? What was your first assignment? What do you remember about it? And so on. And so those who chose to participate, more than 100 of them, more 150 of them, wow, wrote out these lengthy, thoughtful, introspective, sometimes handwritten on legal paper, sometimes typed. But then they all got sort of put into a file, into 19 Hollinger boxes in the Special Collections Archive at the Nimitz Library at the Naval Academy. And they did not really get a lot of attention. As far as I know, I'm the only one who has been through them. Certainly, I'm the only one who's been through them all. But what they gave me was a really sharp look at not only what they did, but what they thought and what it meant to them to participate in this war. So this is a study from the day they showed up at the Naval Academy as 17-year-olds, for the most part, on a sweltering, typical Annapolis summer day in June of 1936. The 4 years they spent at the Naval Academy and what that was like for them. And it hasn't changed a whole lot, but it's changed a little bit. And then the 5 years that they spent in the Navy as junior officers, and it ends with the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri on September 2nd, 1945. So those 9 years saw them grow from callow, inexperienced, nervous young men to, in the most cases, lieutenant commanders or majors, or in a few cases, lieutenant colonels. Who were pretty much running the war.
I'm really excited for the subject matter of this book because we've all heard the stories about the West Point grads, right? We all know everything the West Points do, but to get this angle, to get this aspect of the Navy and what the Annapolis graduates went through, the amount of research that probably went into this book. Like you said, it's spanning 9 years. That's a tremendous amount of research and chronicalization. And not to mention, as Dennis could tell you, trying to figure out what gets cut and what doesn't.
Yeah, that's true. But in addition to that, one of the problems I confronted was I wanted to make sure everything I did where I talked about these young men was contextualized. So I not only had to say what they did, I had to explain where they were and why they were there and who else was with them and what were the circumstances. So if I'm talking about Guadalcanal, men who were on the 4 cruisers that were attacked by the Japanese at Savo Island, for example, I had to explain what those cruisers were doing at Savo Island. So the real difficulty, I think, was mixing the big view of the war itself with the then close-in personal view of the individuals who were manning the second turret or the machine gun battery or some other aspect of those cruisers. So that was an interesting job. And putting it all together, as you say, in what I hope is a seamless narrative, I think was a real challenge, but also a lot of fun.
When doing the research, and as you said, you started prior to the war, but during your research and looking into this, was there a clear differentiation between pre-war training or community at Annapolis and then, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor and we got to get ready to move? Did they streamline things? Did things get changed up drastically? Did they kind of maintain their existing regiment?
Well, for them, there are 2 milestones. One is graduation. Oh boy, we're not midshipmen anymore. This is great. Now we're in the real Navy. And 160 of them got sent to, this little place in the mid-Pacific called Pearl Harbor. So they are all there in 1941. And in fact, the first thing a junior officer wants to try to do is qualify as officer of the deck. Now, to do that, you've got to spend about a year or so learning all, what your responsibilities and so on, and able to handle emergencies. And while at sea, a battleship, for example, would probably have a senior lieutenant or lieutenant commander as officer of the deck, who is in effect in charge of the ship. But when the ship's in port, and especially on a weekend, you can turn that job over to a junior officer, say somebody who's recently qualified as officer of the deck. And as it turned out, 3 of these guys, 3 of them were officers of the deck on the California, the Oklahoma, and the Arizona on Sunday morning, December 7th, 1941.
You want to talk about taking on responsibility? That's a graduate program right there.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
Wow. Craig, how did you hear about those letters that you were talking about that were vaulted away? Did you stumble on that by accident or how did that
not
happen?
Really. I knew about it when it was being created because the class of 1940 wanted a Naval Academy history professor, which I was, to assume some responsibility for, collecting them, organizing them, putting them in box, keeping them in more or less chronological, or in this case, alphabetical order. And one of my colleagues, Robert William Love, now retired, was the guy who did that job. And so I knew from him and from them at the time it was being created that this archive existed. But it wasn't really until I'd finished with the Nimitz project that I decided I'm going to look into this and see what's in there. And of course, what I discovered is a treasure trove.
Well, I got to tell you, sir, I just ordered it right now.
Oh, good.
Me too.
I'm a little bit upset at you, sir, because I have a stack of books beside my bed about this high. And now
it's 3 inches taller.
Yeah.
Now it's another inch taller. That's right.
I just can't wait to get into it. I'm so excited already. Oh my gosh.
It catapulted to number 1 on my reading list too.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you. I hope your readers feel the same. Your listeners feel the same way.
Oh, I'm sure.
Well, the thing that also excites Dennis and Zach both is they've both had enormous experiences of digging through artifacts and reading handwritten letters and diary entries and researching their own books. And so the fact that you had this basically unsealed treasure trove that's been sealed up hermetically in a shelf somewhere, and for who knows why, up to this point, you're the only one who seemed to either show interest or knew that it was there, and to have access to unspoiled history in and of itself is
Yeah.
enough to excite
Well,
anybody.
it was kind of in raw shape when I first took it on. I would go into the archive with the phone that I'm holding in my hand, and I'd turn a page and say, oh my God, this is gold. And I'd take a picture of it. And then another page, and then I'd take a picture of that. Well, then, of course, I would go home every day for about a year with 30, 40, 50, 60 photographs of these often handwritten, sometimes typed, which I was always grateful for. But then I'd have to upload them on my computer, print them off on my printer, and then, work from that. So there was some mining that had to be done, but the class did the lion's share of the work for me. It was raw material, but it was absolutely wonderful material.
But that mining kind of allows you to almost pre-parse out information that you kind of feel that you won't really need, correct? So it's almost a little bit of...
To be sure.
Yeah.
There were many pages, I turned the page and said, no, we don't need this. This is not pertinent. This is not relevant. This is not interesting. Now, of course, some of the not interesting stuff you want to include because, yes, thousands of young men were at the point of the spear, flying planes, driving ships, in subs, charging a beach, whatever they might be doing. And the class members of 1940 went to every service selection. So I follow about a dozen of them. If you can think of this as kind of like the naval equivalent of not the boys, and what am I thinking of?
Band of Brothers.
Band of Brothers. These are Band of Brothers who go to sea. But of course, they don't operate together. They're scattered all over the globe, and they run into each other once in a while. One serendipitously will be plucked from the sea by another when the Yorktown sinks and he's hauled onto a accompanying destroyer. So they connect and reconnect as the war goes on. So that makes the story, gives the story an interesting edge as well.
I have a couple things for you, sir. First of all, Zach and I already have a plan for when the apocalypse happens. We are going to, while everybody else does whatever they're going to do, Zach and I are
Wednesday,
going to meet
by
at
the
the
way.
National Archives. We're going to meet at the National Archives in College Park with a bag of MREs.
Yeah.
And we're just going to go in.
Oh, yeah.
And do exactly what you were so fortunate to be able to do.
Yeah. Been there and done that. No MREs, but spent a lot of time in the National Archives. Wonderful place, by the way.
I hear they make a great black coffee.
Ask you, in your writing career, with the advent of Excel spreadsheets and Word, how has your writing? You have all these fellas that you've got to keep track of.
Right.
What does that look like in your office? Is it an Excel spreadsheet? Is it Post-it notes on the wall? Is it a graph? What does that look like?
Great question.
You are talking to an analog 19th century historian. I'm afraid I do stuff on paper. I have stacks and stacks of paper. I have bankers' boxes full of notes and drafts. But the one absolutely essential thing that the computer has done for me is it allows me to rewrite. And truth be told, that's the part of book production I like the most. The research is fun because you come across stuff and go, oh, wow, look at this. And the writing is interesting because you're crafting it and putting it together, and this goes here and that goes there, or maybe this doesn't go anywhere. But what I like most, to be honest with you, is once I have kind of a draft, I like rewriting. I like to look at it the way I think my Naval Academy students would want to approach it. How much background do they need to know to understand the context here? What do they want to know about these characters and their personal lives that helps them identify with what they were doing? So as I go through it and rewrite it, you can do that so easily on a word processing system. And I use Word. That's the one I use. I mean, there are others as well, but and then I'll rewrite it again and again and again. So what comes out, the one you just ordered, is probably something like the 14th draft. So the great thing about computers is not the spreadsheets, for me anyway, but simply the opportunity to fine tune the writing itself.
I wanted to ask you, one of the searches that I do on Google whenever I'm researching a subject is I will enter in the keywords, let's just say George S. Patton papers, location of.
Yeah.
So where have you decided where the Dr. Craig Symonds papers are going to be going?
you
Great
touch a
question.
you touch a nerve there. Um, yeah, I mean, before I can offer my archives, as I said, I have bankers boxes full of notes and papers and drafts and other things. Um, and before I can really go to an archive, probably the Naval Academy,
Mhm.
possibly the Naval War College, and say, here's a collection, would you like this? I have to organize that stuff. I have to get rid of duplicates and put them in order and put them in files. And that's a job at least as big as writing a book. So I have put that off, sadly to say. So not sure where they'll end up, but probably one of those two places.
Excellent, excellent. Well, I can tell you that I know Zach and I would probably be on that list to offer our services.
Oh yeah, right.
Hey,
Like I said, great
be
question.
careful what you offer.
No, I'm very serious about that. I did that for the William L. McGee archive.
No,
Um,
yeah.
I did his archive. I organized that and we gave it to the museum there in Fredericksburg.
Yeah, terrific.
So
Yeah, that's right.
that's a treasure trove what you have there. I know you've looked at it hundreds and hundreds of times, but for the young historians of the future, they're gonna really want to look at those papers. That's why I asked. That's awesome.
Oh yeah. And speaking of papers and archives and all the information that you collected, Craig, I have to ask, with all these stories and all the treasure trove of documents you came across, do you have a favorite story or a most noteworthy story that stands
Mm.
above the rest that you came across during this whole project?
Well, I got to know these. I felt like I got to know these guys. I call them my kids, my boys. They're all gone now, of course. The last one died in 2016, so they're certainly not kids anymore. But that's the way I see them, because they were between the ages of 17 and a few cases even 16, and then 26, 27 years old when the war ended. So they seemed like kids to me, and I got to know them. So there are individual stories probably of each one. A few of them are more colorful than others. I particularly got to enjoy the antics of, excuse me, I'm sorry, John Locketer, Lockeuture. John Locketer went to one of the most prestigious prep schools in the country, the Latin School in Boston. But he saw a battleship floating in Narragansett Bay when he was 9 years old, never forgot it, was determined to go to the Naval Academy, and did. He went to a prep school and got the highest score in the country on the qualifying exam, got an appointment, got in. But John Locketer was a cut up. I mean, when he was in Hawaii, he read in the paper that some well-to-do heiress was giving a party for the pilots in Hawaii, and he contacted her and he said, well, why are you doing that for them? What about us destroyer men? Shouldn't you give a party for us too? Well, she did. So she put on a big party, and I mean, that's just the kind of thing he would do. As an example, when he graduated from the Naval Academy, out of a class of 456, he was in the top 100 academically and the bottom 20 on behavior. So that's the kind of guy he was. It's the kind of guy you'd like next to you. He'd be a great wingman to have. So there are those personalities that I felt I got to know in putting this story together. I mean, another one, if you want for a particularly exciting story, the captain of the Naval Academy basketball team, Joe Hanley, Mike Hanley, actually, Michael Joseph Hanley, started out in blimps, of all things, but he ended up in destroyers, and he's the executive officer on the USS Dashiell, and it arrives in Okinawa on April the 3rd, 1945. It's sent out to be a picket destroyer at the northern end of the picket line north of Okinawa on April 4th, which is the day the Japanese launched 750 planes from Kyushu, half of them kamikazes, to take out the American fleet at Okinawa. And of course, the very first ship they saw were the picket destroyers. and the Dashiell was attacked by 20 planes in less than an hour, with Mike Hanley down in the CIC running the radar, giving whole direction. I mean, just, you can imagine what that was like. And of course, he describes it in this brilliant, evocative prose that no one had looked at until now.
Wow.
So that's a pretty good story.
Wow.
I just can't imagine being confined to a vessel while the sky is literally falling in on you and having limited, places to go. Not that you have a whole heck of a lot of places to go if you're on terra firma. I mean, you're still limited to the distance to which you can run, but at least you have the delusion of, hey, if something were to go crazy, I'd have a place to go versus being confined on a ship.
And in a way, you can multiply that for those who were serving in a submarine.
Yeah.
I mean, you think about being in a submarine, being attacked by, in one case, one of my kids was in a submarine that was attacked by 3 destroyers at the same time, with depth charges going off and the pinging sonar and trying to keep quiet, and they're running silent, and they go to the bottom. The ship's been tested down to 250 feet, but they go down to 405 feet to the bottom to try to escape it. And afterward, members of the crew broke out in boils and hives because the tension was so great. Wow. That's pretty tough too.
My goodness.
I can't even imagine.
No. The closest I could come to that is probably when in Alaska, when I stepped on a ground wasp nest.
Yikes.
And they come tearing out, and I didn't know which direction they were coming at me, but they were definitely zapping me.
Yeah.
That's and also 9/11, when we didn't know how many more planes there were. We thought it was over, and then you hear about the Pentagon, and then you hear about Pennsylvania, and you're like, oh my gosh, what other cities? Chicago, Los Angeles.
Right.
I mean, it's not anywhere near, of course, I'm not anywhere near that, but what it was out there in Okinawa. But
kind of get you thinking post-war on how that version of PTSD, right? Because we're all familiar with the infantry version. The fireworks on 4th of July might cause someone to freak out, or the backfiring of a 56 Buick might cause someone to hit the deck. But having PTSD of being in cramped quarters, such as a submarine or a small vessel, and then going into post-war life, I mean, you probably won't be a steam fitter. There's going to be a lot of jobs that you probably wouldn't be able to mentally handle if you feel enclosed.
It's interesting. A lot of these guys came to the Naval Academy. Remember, they came in 1936. The Depression is on. There are no jobs. There's no place to go. Colleges are too expensive. Hardly anybody can afford it anyway. So the golden ticket to either West Point or Annapolis gets them out of this economic conundrum. And a lot of them did it because it just seemed the smart thing to do. And yet, after those 4 years of brutal war, all of the ones that I follow in my storyline here, stayed in.
Wow.
And did a full career. They all retired as captains. Few of them became rear admirals or generals in the Marine Corps, major general in the Marine Corps. But they stayed in for the duration of their careers. A couple of them got divorced, and I think that may be an indication of some of the difficulties they were dealing with. But it's fascinating to me that they made that decision.
Wow.
A little bit off topic,
Let's go, by all means.
I was wondering, is there a moment in your career, with long career and esteemed career, is there a moment in particular that you kind of had to pinch yourself? You couldn't believe you were lucky enough to be there at that moment with whoever was there.
Yeah, more than one, I have to say. Wow. They say that a lot of life is luck. I mean, you make decisions, of course, and the decisions matter, but the circumstances have to be there to allow you to make that decision. So when I was on active duty in uniform, just after I got commissioned at Officer Candidate School, I was offered a job to be a flag lieutenant for the president of the Naval War College. Now, what ensign gets that job? And then when he retired a year later, the new president of the Naval War College, Admiral Stansfield Turner, later the CIA director, wanted to change the curriculum to focus on historical case studies and was looking for people who had degrees in history and guess who had one? So Admiral Turner gave me an opportunity that was truly remarkable. I had to pinch myself when that happened. So teaching at the Naval War College when I was 23 years old, and my students were captains and Marine Corps colonels and Army colonels who were old enough to be my father. That was amazing. And then after I finished that, I was hired at the Naval Academy. I mean, there is no better job. There is no better job in the country than teaching midshipmen at the Naval Academy. They're eager, they're enthusiastic, they're smart, they're disciplined. They're just wonderful young men and women. And so I did that for 30 years, and I pinched myself every year when I had that opportunity. So yeah, a lot of pinching going on in my life. Yes, absolutely.
Oh, wow. I have a question for you, Craig, and this is a question that I've had since 2013 when I found out you were doing research at the LCI archives at the Fredericksburg Museum. Now, before we started recording, for our audience, Dennis was talking about how about 10 years back, Craig went to the Fredericksburg Museum, the Pacific War Museum in Texas, and he did a lot of research with the amphibious forces. And he looked up things like the LCIs, the LSTs. The question I have for you, Craig, is, I mean, like me and Dennis, we have a connection, kind of a niche piece of history, the amphibious forces. What brought you to the museum to do research on the amphibious forces for Neptune?
Well, three things, actually. My very good friend, Michael Hagee, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, with whom I served at the Naval Academy, invited me to become a member of the board of directors at that museum, which I did for 6 years. And that was a good experience. And in the process, I learned what a treasure trove is available there. So I used the archive in Fredericksburg for my book on the Battle of Midway. There was a lot of stuff there, firsthand accounts. Dick Bess has a long oral history that I don't think is anyplace else. I mean, he does have other oral histories, but there was new and original material at Fredericksburg, and that was great. So when I decided to tackle D-Day, the Navy's role in D-Day, Neptune, which you held up in front of the camera earlier, and I appreciate, I knew I wanted to understand as much as I possibly could about the amphibs. And you're right that, the amphibs are kind of like the unappreciated ugly ducklings of the war. They were absolutely essential. I have argued in print and elsewhere that the LST, no shade on the LCIs, but the LST was probably the most important ship of the whole war. Carriers, battleships, cruisers, yeah. But the LST, unglamorous, unnamed. They didn't even have individual names. They had numbers. But without the LST, not only could we not have carried out the D-Day operation in Normandy, we probably could not have carried out the Trans-Pacific campaign, the Central Pacific Drive. I mean, they were so in the age of armored warfare. If you can't put armor on the beach early on in your invasion, you probably can't do it. And so the LCI, which actually was a relatively new acquisition at the time, when I got into LCIs, I thought, this is priceless stuff. LCIs, for those who don't know, the LST can bring armor ashore, trucks, tanks, jeeps, and so on. The LCIs brings the infantry, and these twin ramps drop down on either side of the bow, and the troops just run down that bow and onto the beach, and they're quite vulnerable. I mean, they don't have a lot of protection, and they don't have a lot of offensive punch. But again, they got the soldiers to the beach. I mean, the first wave, of course, are the Higgins boats, and we've all seen, Tom Hanks and others jump out of Higgins boats and run up the beach. But the LCIs brought the bulk of the soldiers ashore, both there and elsewhere. So they were critical. So that's what drew me to that, was my study of Normandy.
I really never gave it much thought before, but as you're saying that, I'm trying to think, on the global worldwide scale of World War, was there another piece of transportation that moved as many personnel as they did? And I have a hard time thinking of one.
Well, you could argue, if you wanted to, that the regular transport ships that carried American soldiers from America to Britain carried more soldiers total, but they didn't deposit them.
Yeah, I was going to say, you can get them there, but you need a way to get them on the soil.
Exactly.
That's the difference.
Yeah,
you're right.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you can build an interstate, but without an off-ramp, you're just running in a circle.
There you go.
Oh, yeah. One of the things I learned from your book, Craig, was I had no idea that it was discussed at the highest echelons of government. Like Winston Churchill is literally fighting over these LSTs You know,
Yeah.
they're delaying the D-Day invasion because they didn't meet their quota of LSTs. Like all of that stuff is great information that I had no idea. And I recently was on NBC arguing the same thing you were arguing in the book, that, you know, I love the LCI history, but really the way you laid it out in Neptune is the LSTs quite possibly were the most important vessel.
Yeah, I labeled that chapter with a quotation from Churchill, some goddamn things called LSTs. But to give him credit, he really initiated the idea of creating a vessel that could deposit armored tanks and trucks and so on onto the beach. And the idea of a cupboard in the bow, that kind of came from him. And the very first ones were British design, and they took oil tankers from Lake Maracaibo in Venezuela and modified them to carry tanks and tried them out. They tried them out at Dieppe. That did not work too well. And what's interesting is not only did he help design the initial version of what became the LST, the tanks they carried were called the Churchill tank, and the ships themselves were called Winstons. This guy was not that modest.
Well, speaking of supply and demand and having enough, how many shipyards did we have manufacturing those simultaneously during the height of the war?
The number that jumps into my head is 170, and I'd be more comfortable if I could check that number, but I think that's probably pretty close. And what's interesting is less than half of those existed when the war began. You know, there are people who say that today, well, we couldn't do that now because we don't have the building capacity. Well, they didn't have the building capacity in 1940 either, but we built the building capacity. They built new shipyards and new slipways, and then built new ships in those slipways, in the new shipyards. So don't underestimate the resiliency of American productivity.
And to that point, I was just at a D-Day event on the 7th, and I had my EE8 field phones, and I was talking to somebody about retooling our manufacturing, and I took the cover off of the Bakelite mouthpiece off the phone and held it up. Manufacturer, Kellogg. So just goes to show you, everybody was making everything back then. You didn't have to be, you know, a Bakelite manufacturer. If you had warehouses, we'll retool it and we'll get it up and running.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's pretty awesome.
Well, there were 30,000 components necessary to make up an LST, and they were manufactured all over the country and then shipped by rail to the building sites where they were assembled. I always think the way to connect with the younger generation is it's a gigantic Lego set, and you've got 30,000 pieces, and you got to put them all together, and you have to weld them together. Prior to this, of course, ships were generally riveted, but you can use less steel if you weld because you don't have an overlap when you weld instead of when you rivet. So they were saving just a tiny bit of steel with each ship. Of course, the downside of that was every once in a while, in a particularly powerful storm, the welds would come apart.
Really? I figured the tolerances would be stronger. That's amazing.
No. As a sailor described it, it's like watching a run in a woman's stocking. They just zip. And perhaps the most notorious example of that was when the USS Pittsburgh was dealing with the typhoon off Japan, not the first Halsey typhoon, but the second Halsey typhoon. The skipper saw those welds moving a little bit, and the bow was going up and down independent of the rest of the hull. He pulled everybody out of the bow, closed the watertight doors, and sure enough, the bow of the Pittsburgh, 170 feet of it, just ripped right off and floated away. So there were some drawbacks to using welding instead of rivets.
Now that you say that, it makes sense. Like when you're explaining the rip of the tear, I'm thinking of the herringbone twill uniforms, right? The reason they use herringbones, it hypothetically would stop a tear. Well, that rivet would be almost like that same stopping point. You'd have to start again around that rivet. So yeah, that does make sense now that when you visualize it that way. But yeah, you think counterintuitively, you would think that a weld would have a stronger tolerance, but no, that's amazing. Prior to the war, was the selection process, I guess would be the correct terminology, was the selection process to get in Annapolis in the mid to late 30s the same or similar as it is during the war or even post-war years?
You know, I don't know about during the war, but it was very different from what exists today.
Okay.
And I'll tell you the way it worked. From the beginning, you know, each congressman and each senator had the privilege of nominating a candidate from his district to go to one, either of, or both of the service academies. And for a while, in the 20s and 30s in particular, some congressmen used that as a way to reward friends, children of big donors or supporters or the mayor's son or whatever. But what they found was that a lot of people were upset by that. I mean, there are more disappointed people who didn't make it than the one who did. So virtually everyone adopted a process of giving an exam in their district. And the person who got the highest score on the exam would then get the nomination. That's one exam. Then that candidate also had to take an academy exam to be admitted. So every successful candidate had to pass two exams. And to make sure that they had a pretty good chance, a lot of them went to preparatory schools, schools that were created specifically to help young men be successful in these admission exams. So it's kind of an ordeal for them. There were no recruited athletes at all in those days. So everybody took exams and the highest scores got in, and that was it.
Well, I mean, it seemed like the only way to ensure that you're getting the cream of the crop, right? You don't want to water down your candidates through nepotism and favors. So,
that's absolutely true. But having served on the admissions board at the Naval Academy myself, I can tell you that in the modern era, it's a bit more complex. They apply to the Naval Academy, not to their congressman. And the Naval Academy goes through their records rigorously and applies points to various things: grade point average, SAT scores, varsity athletics, leadership in school, Eagle Scout. I mean, there are a near infinite number of things for which you can obtain points. And you must have a minimum of 55,000 points to be qualified. So we make up a list of the qualified candidates from any particular congressman's district with the one with the highest score at the top and then on down the list. And we send that to him or her. And we say, this is the candidate from your district that we think you should nominate. And 90% of the time, that's what they do.
Wow.
Well, let me ask you this for our listening audience. Perhaps someone has a son or daughter at home. It's in middle school. They're kind of like, maybe this is an option. What are things that they could do extracurricularly, like you suggested, Eagle Scouts, in a modern day that they could kind of start prepping their kid to do before they even get to high school to help them have a better chance of being accepted to that selection process?
Well, let me start with curricular before I go to extracurricular.
Okay.
I think probably the most important thing is to take the hardest courses your school offers. Make sure you're in the top math track and science track and all the other, because they're looking hard at that. Because even though you can be a history major at the Naval Academy, and a lot of history majors make admiral, they do quite well. But the core curriculum is heavily STEM. So make sure that when you send in your high school transcript, it's got physics and chemistry and calculus on that list, and that you got A's in them. So that's probably the most important thing. SAT is important as well. But as far as extracurricular activities, they want to know that you're a well-rounded, a fully rounded individual. Sports is one way. If you engage in sports year-round, that's to your credit. You don't have to be a star. We just want to see that you're interested in a physical activity. Clubs, if you're in Scouts, that's great. It's not an automatic bump up, but it shows, again, the well-rounded interests of somebody who's a candidate for the Naval Academy. Here's something I suggest to anybody who is serious about it, and that is when you're a sophomore in high school, apply to what's called a summer seminar. It's kind of like summer camp. It's at the academy, and for a week, you will live like a midshipman. You'll sleep in Bancroft Hall, you'll get up early, you'll go for a run, you'll visit classes, you'll do some athletics in the afternoon, but you get a sense of what the place is like. And I think that's probably one of the best things you can do to make sure that you are a fit for a very particular institution.
Dennis, put your hand down. They don't offer that for gentlemen our age.
No,
I
I'm
know
sorry.
you're
Dennis, I
dying.
don't think
You're like, how can I
you
get
know
into
me.
that? I want to bunk out for the
You
weekend.
can see the wheels turning.
I
couldn't
saw you
you?
like, ooh,
Yeah,
do they have
yeah.
a senior
and
program?
Dennis, I'm sorry to say this. I'm not sure you could do the pull-ups either.
Ooh,
Ouch.
Roger,
got in
Roger
the
that.
throne.
Oh my God.
I could do the
Oh,
long
Well,
run, but yeah.
this has been amazing, and I know we've got a hard stop in 3 minutes. And sir, there's a question that I have for you. We've talked about this a lot on this podcast. Is how fortunate Zachary and I were that we were able to pull from World War II letters and things like that. What are your thoughts on the future for historians that are going to have to write about Iraq and Afghanistan and hopefully get a hold of old
Yeah.
emails or get a hold of
Yeah, it is a
Old
problem,
Sony
and I'm
Cybershock.
in a way I'm grateful that I won't have to do that, but I'm sure creative historians in the future will find a way. But a lot of stuff is going to disappear too, that into the ether. How much of it is recoverable and how it's recoverable,
Yeah.
I'm not technologically proficient enough to be able to say. But you're right. When you've got a hard copy of a letter, dear wife, here I am sitting in a foxhole and missing you. I mean, are we still going to have that? I don't know.
Yeah.
Real quick,
Wow.
just kind of playing off of that, I worked in terrestrial radio for 6 years. I was a producer for an afternoon show. Back in the 90s, mid-2000s, they reached out to all the media manufacturers saying, hey, what is the best long-term form that we can store our audio files on? They thought it was CDs. Turns out CDs break down. That foil breaks down.
Right.
Out of
Yeah.
all the mediums in the world, the engineers, I think at Sony or JVC, told them VHS tapes. So what they would do
No
is
kidding.
so they were doing this back in the 90s. They would take their DAT tapes from the radio, convert it to VHS tapes. And when I worked there in 2013 up until 2016, we had a VCR that every day we'd pull a tape out because they were on the same radio station since 1994 all the way up until last year. So during the show, we would pull a VHS tape out, had it plugged into a computer, hit play, hit record, and digitize it off of VHS tapes because it turns out the VHS tapes did not break down, unlike what the DVD salesman told us.
Right,
Wow.
right. No, I've been told that about CDs. I did not know that about VCRs.
Yeah, the CDs, the actual CD, that film on top breaks down over time, and you can't
Right.
use them. So turns
Wow.
out, get a VCR and find some old tapes. But yeah, it's crazy. Craig, where can people find you? Get a hold of your books, website, emails, anywhere.
Don't
people
have a
can track it down?
website, but the best place to go, I'll have to say the cheapest price you can get is on Amazon. They still can beat Barnes & Noble and others. I'd like to say it's at your local bookstore, and it may be, and I like to support local bookstores, but truth be known, Amazon still gives you the best deal.
Head over to Amazon, and you can hit follow the author and get all the latest updates. And as always, we will link
Indeed.
to everything on WTSPWorldWar2.com. We want to thank you for your time, sir. It's been a
Thank
pleasure.
you so much,
You
sir.
bet.
Hey,
My
thanks,
pleasure. It's fun,
Craig.
guys. Thanks
Thank
a
you
lot.
so much.
Pleasure having
Okay.
you.
That was
Oh,
fantastic.
wow. Yeah. That was a good one.
Just a heads up to you guys, head over to youtube.com. I posted last episode's video version of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast where myself, Dennis, and Jeff were talking about how we can go about preserving living history and maybe start trying to work your way up into the ranks as your senior officers start to age out. You can kind of help maintain these hobbies. But the reason you want to go check out the video format is during the video, I kind of interlace some of the photos of the displays we talked about, Dennis's equipment, but more importantly, stick through the whole video because at the end, I included Dennis's video that he talked about where he was kind of walking through the display. And I also included video footage that I shot at our D-Day event that really, we were so busy talking to the public, which is great. I didn't have a whole lot of time to shoot a bunch of video. So I had this nice video of our displays with no context to put it in. So I added that to the end of the video as well as some archival footage because we talked about John Thomas, who was one of the reenactors who passed away over the last year and a half. I found footage of me and him at one of my first or second events, like 2012, 2013, where I'm wearing my Marine Corps HBTs and we're doing a weapons demo for the public down here in Naples. It's older footage. It's shot on a less than great cell phone, but you get the idea. You can see John Thomas doing his thing. And if you've never been to a living history event and seen a weapons demo, you get an idea of what that's like. So go check out the last episode we just did of the What's the Scuttlebutt podcast. And you can see that footage that Dennis, myself, and the photos of the young man that Jeff was talking about. And we're going to have this week's episode up here in probably a few days as well. So real quick, let's do a quick round robin of what you're reading. Zach, you're the new temporary, co-host spot filler for Jeff. So what you reading, fella?
All right. Well, I'll tell you what I just finished. I actually just finished Dennis's book, Bonsai Cliff, which was about the story of Saipan. Audiences, go check it out. It's a real quick read. I think it's like less than 100 pages. You get through it probably in a day, less than a day. Mm-hmm. And it has a lot of really incredible information in there that I didn't even know existed. So that was great. But what I'm currently reading right now is Joseph Balkowski's Beyond the Beachhead, which is a history of the 29th Infantry Division at Normandy. And that's I'm halfway through. It's already one of the best books I've ever read. I wish I would have picked it up and read it 20 years ago.
Really?
Because it was that good. Yeah, it not only explains the guys in the story, it has one of the best background information chapters that I've ever come across, where it explains even the basics of infantry units and artillery. And I learned a whole bunch about just basic artillery units that I didn't know before. And it's just one of the best books I've ever read. So that's what I'm reading right now, Beyond the Beachhead.
When you guys read books like this, obviously when you hear interviews with musicians, for example, they talk about their influences. I was influenced by this band and this band and this band. And if you go listen to my third album, you can hear at the time I was listening to this band and my album's influenced by them. Do you guys find that when you read a book that really just kicks it to you, like you're explaining, that it kind of influences your writing, whether it's a book or article or an entry, whatever? Do you find that you kind of pick up a little bit of their influence for at least a short period of time, if not long term?
Oh, absolutely. I can even just name a couple books that are like that to me. One of the very first ones I ever read was Laura Hildenbrand's Unbroken, the story of Louis Zamperini. And that was, to this day, one of the best. And I remember closing that, taking a deep breath, and then going to my computer and start writing, because it was that really catapulted. It was such a great book. But then also, and I know, Dennis, you'll agree with me on this one because you've read it too, The Cincinnati by John H. Morrell, the story of the Black Cat Flotilla 13 in the Pacific. And that one really was the one that got me started writing LC Item articles for the LC Item newsletter. It was one of the best written books. And it's too bad because it's out of publication now, so it's really difficult to get. But, to our audiences, if you can find a copy of The Cincinnati by Admiral John H. Morrell, you will not regret picking that up and reading it.
We talk a lot about Amazon on here. When it comes to out-of-print stuff, do not sleep on eBay. You can find a lot of good stuff on there.
That's right.
Oh, yeah.
I know eBay's old school, but that's where the old school stuff is.
Yeah, for sure.
Because there's a lot of older people or even younger people. There's a lot of people who have cool things sitting around that it doesn't justify creating an Amazon account. They're just going to throw it up on eBay or even Facebook Marketplace, for that matter.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dennis, what you reading?
Well, I want to touch on what you just asked,
sure,
Zach, about the books that we read. Do they influence our writing? And absolutely. I mean, Ernie Pyle for me, right? Ernie Pyle.
Oh yeah.
Like, hands down, first up. His writing style was so great that they gave him a column, right? And everybody across the nation read it. Why did they read it? They read it because he was like sitting down with their son in a trench somewhere, drinking a cup of Joe in the mud, and just having a conversation. And the one thing that I loved about Ernie Pyle that I incorporate in my writing is that he lists the name of the guy, but not just his first name, his last name, and the city where he came from, right? And I just love that. Another one that influenced me very heavily is Stephen Ambrose.
Yeah.
And all of his books, Pegasus Bridge, D-Day, of course, Band of Brothers. I mean, absolutely love that. And there's just something about Stephen Ambrose's ability to take you on these large operations, but yet it feels like you're still among these regular guys and gals, and you're just along for the ride. And it's almost like you're on a Discovery Channel documentary following this team, and you get to look over the cameraman's shoulder, and he brings you along on this journey of cops, right? You get to go along on this journey, and you can't believe you're there. That's the kind of writing that I really enjoy and try to incorporate into my own. As far as what I'm reading,
Real quick,
hands
I
down.
want to pause real quick because you mentioned Ernie Pyle and war correspondence, and then you went on to documentaries. Did either one of you see the Netflix series Five Came Back about war correspondence and Hollywood producers and their contribution to the film industry during the war?
I don't believe I've seen that. Is that on a certain streaming
Netflix.
platform?
It's on Netflix. At least it was produced on Netflix. I doubt they released it to any other service. I googled it. It's still shows Netflix. It's a very, very good documentary.
You'll like it, Zach. It's really great.
Yeah, I think it came out 6, 7 years, 2017. That's a very good one.
Little side note, documentary wise, just a little plug for Ken Burns. I just watched, listened to Joe Rogan's
I saw that he was on there
podcast with Ken Burns, and he just finished a new documentary series on the American Revolution.
Wow.
And so I think he said it's going to be 8 episodes, and that's going to be coming out in the next several months. So
you were talking about the cool things that you liked about Ernie Pyle. Not only did they talk about the first name, the last name, but where they're from. And when you were saying that, I was having an audio dialogue in my head. I think it was from Ken Burns' The War, where they had Tom Hank read newspaper clippings from like some small town in Illinois.
Yeah, Lucerne, Minnesota.
Yeah, because he would do. Oh, and then they had other people. Every time they introduced someone in that series, they would do the first name, last name, and the city they grew up in. So that's every time I hear that kind of format, it reminds me of that very, very good document. That series was great.
I just appreciate that because I don't ever want anyone to just assume that I'm talking about some other guy. Like I want my readers to know this guy from this hometown, he experienced this.
Yeah.
And there's no confusion about who you're talking about. And he gets credit or she gets credit for what they experienced. I just really appreciate that about Ernie Pyle and Ambrose.
Well, to that point, the world was smaller back then, right? And what I mean by that is we're so interconnected now that our influences are kind of spread out. Whereas back then, your influences was the geographical location in which you could travel, which back then, a lot of times wasn't very far. Some of these guys never left their hometowns. And so their hometown really predicted their personality traits and their education and their influences and their upbringing and whether they're a farmer, a hunter, a trapper, a steel worker, a plumber, a city slicker, what have you. And so to include their city, not even state, but more the granular level of their city, if you were to take the time and do the research on the city at that time, it really gives you a window into that person's soul and upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Oh, yeah. And I'm glad you said Ernie Pyle, because if I had to pick one correspondent that I quoted the most in my book, it was definitely Ernie Pyle. I love the way that he writes. And like you guys are saying, sometimes he went as far as to even list his hometown address to the person he was interviewing. You know, this person from this unit, you know, from somewhere Pennsylvania, you know, 123 Elm Street, you know, he would actually put their address.
Yeah,
to
the
it.
address.
It's indisputable that that's the guy. So I love that about him, too.
Yeah, and you know, Burgess Meredith portrayed him in the story of G.I. Joe. When Robert Mitchum was in that. Robert Mitchum plays the captain. That's the Italian campaign, and Burgess Meredith is just he's Ernie Pyle, and it's just this. Have you guys ever seen it? The story of G.I. Joe?
No. What's the name of the movie? That's
the story of G.I. Joe.
Okay.
And it's Ernie Pyle following this unit that he writes about, and the scenes there, and I gotta give him props too. One of the reasons that movie really stands out to me personally is their depiction of PTSD with the sergeant, who is he's just just a great leader of men, and he's always taking the hard missions for himself. He's always making sure all his guys are fed. He's making sure everybody's got ammo. He can't do anything about their cleanliness, but at least he can get them out of the rain, you know, and this and that. And I won't ruin the what happens, but there's a scene in there where everybody has their limit, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it's right out of the book, and it's just beautifully filmed. And I think it's probably one of the first, that one in the Best Years of Our Lives, that movie. I think it's one of the first, the story of G.I. Joe, to really show PTSD. and it's hard hitting. It's hard hitting. It's really something.
What year did that come out?
I'm not sure. Yeah, I'm not sure. It's a black
yeah.
and white movie. Robert Mitchum in one of his first appearances in a lead role.
Wow, they wasted no time making 1945. War
Yeah.
had barely even wrapped up, but they probably started filming it in 44.
Yeah, and it's, it's just so man, I just have so much admiration for Ernie Pyle. But
Oh, me too.
So, what
Don-
book are you reading?
yeah, so far as as far as
I
far as
forgot
what I'm
already,
reading,
too.
that's an easy answer. I'm reading hundreds of pages of service records because Zach trained me to track down and request these files, and I've requested over 100 already, and I've got now I'm working on the 438 crew. So, by the time I'm done, it'll be 400 files that I'll have. But just a matter of fact, before we started, I received 2 today from the National Archives. So I was going through the file for Ensign Donald Cromer from my grandpa's gunboat, who is wounded, and I found out from the file that he got hit in his right thigh, in the front, out the back, and that he was battling seasickness the whole time, and it was debilitating. And Rufus Herring, who receives the Medal of Honor, writes in his officer's report that he's a great guy, very sharp, willing to learn, but is unable to perform his duties because he's always in the bunk, throwing up and vomiting. He can't do this. He can't handle the motion sickness. Of course, that problem was taken care of at Iwo Jima when he was wounded and he was removed to the States. But that's what I've been reading is just hundreds and hundreds of pages of files.
And Don, before we move on to yours, what you're reading and your inspirations, Dennis, if you haven't received Brockmeyer's records, speaking of that, they should arrive by Wednesday. So
awesome! Yeah, I'm
something
super
tells me you
excited
guys are either going to have to give Dennis's mailman or the researcher at the archives a nice Amazon gift card for Christmas.
we talk about that all the time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when they show up in boxes. The mailman's like, oh, not the Dennis Blocker house again.
And you guys should have seen Jeff's great-grandpa's records. I just sent him a box. It was the first record. Instead of an envelope, it came in an actual box.
Wow.
They had someone at the archives had to go fetch a box to fit all these in and send them my way. So, yeah.
Wow, I didn't know my grandfather's packages came in an Amazon box because we all recycle those Amazon boxes.
Back to the Future.
Fun fact, I think, I don't know if they still do, but I remember a couple of years ago, somebody put out like a story or something, like if you took your empty Amazon boxes and broke them down and then put them in another Amazon box, you can ship them back and they would reuse them. But I don't know if they're still doing it. I mean, it makes perfect sense.
Oh, wow.
The amount of cardboard they go through. It makes perfect sense. Right now, the book I'm reading, I'm 3 or 4 chapters into our buddy Henry's book, The Old Breed, The Complete Story Revealed.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
His writing style is very, very similar to his father's. And it's interesting because I know a lot of this stuff is previously unpublished, and Dennis knows too, and Zach, you've been a listener to the show for a while, but when I'm reading this stuff, I'm like, oh yeah, Henry told me and Jeff about this on episode 104. So we're reading this unpublished stuff, but it wasn't that Henry was reading it. He was just telling us stories that his dad told him growing up, and a lot of those stories in the book. And so some of the stuff is new to everybody, but to me and Jeff, it's like, oh yeah, we've heard these in our audience for that matter. So if you've been listening since episode 91, I think it was when he came on, some of these untold stories will ring familiar in your ears because Henry has told them on the show before. And so very excited for him. It's a great book. And so that's that. Just a quick reminder again, please head to youtube.com, look for D410 Media. And you can check out all of our, we're going to do more and more videos. I don't know if anybody's noticed, but I got a nice new camera tonight. I'm actually redoing the studio. I built this studio in 2018, and it hasn't changed much. Still got the old green screen that no one uses anymore. Got a new desk.
It looks good. It looks good.
No, I got a new desk where we're going to rotate the entire room, so you guys will be able to see my collection in the background, the helmets on the wall. Good. Steve, no more fake corrugated steel, all that. So the next episode, we're going to have a different view, and we're going to keep things grinding. And I want to thank each and every one of y'all who who've been hanging out with us since 2018. And for myself, Zach, Dennis, and don't worry, Jeff will be back. He's the guy's super wicked busy. Anybody can tell you who's ever gone through college to be to get history degrees. It's no walk in the park. You got a lot of paperwork to do, and that's what he's doing. So thanks to Zach for hanging out with us. He will be in and out of rotation whenever Jeff's not available. Zach will pick up his role, and we will carry on. But also head over to patreon.com, look for D410 Media as well, or go to WTSPWorldWar2.com, and you can click on Patreon there. And that's it. Thank you guys so much, and we will talk to you all next week.
This has been a Digital 410 production.